presenters. On the screen you can see a few horrifying images. Anybody recollects what are they or from when are they? Not long ago, but on the 9th of May, these events were witnessed in the country of Sri Lanka when the economic crisis set off. Now on 1st of April 2022, the schools were suspended, shut down for 6 months. Fuel was classified as an essential commodity. Patients could not travel to the hospital. The 22 million population could not even have a 2 square meal a day. People had bathed in the public wells, fearing that they could not pay for the water bills. A crisis had started. A crisis had started not in 2022, rather in 2019. But what led to the downfall in 2022? Now some of you would say it was the pandemic, and you wouldn't be wrong. It is partly the pandemic, but the larger factor here is something called as sovereign financing, and that is the topic of my presentation. The title is Sovereign Financing, a Vehicle of Neocolonialism from the Perspective of Sri Lankan Crisis and the Chinese Debt Trap. Now the structure of my presentation for the 15 minutes is as such. I'm going to cover the terminology, the concept of sovereign financing and Chinese debt trap, how sovereign financing was given to Sri Lanka, then understanding it as a vehicle of neocolonialism, especially with regard to Sri Lanka and the Chinese debt trap, and the regulation of sovereign financing, and a few humble recommendations which I seek to give. Now the terminology. Now what is neocolonialism? It arises out of the ashes of colonialism. We all have been, our country has been a part of colonialism, but neocolonialism is a concept wherein subjugation of a country is undertaken via economic matters. Now the person who coined this term was the former president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, who expressed the term neocolonialism in the sense of his country in Ghana, wherein the former colonizers were now investing in the mines and the natural resources, and at the same time exercising control over the country. It was no longer of the colonizer, but it still continued to yield the dominance over the former colonies. Now, how do we define it? To define it, we'll look at a person called Antwi Botang, who gives 4 parameters how to identify the phenomena of neocolonialism, which is stationing military troops, secondly, controlling neocolonial government and policies, thirdly, by economic and monetary power, and lastly, by limiting neocolonial states to only serve neocolonialist power markets. Now, based on this, I want you all to keep this in mind as we go further. We are going to see how all of these are proved, and we in fact see that via Chinese debt trap, neocolonialism, the phenomena of neocolonialism actually is under process. Now, the second important term that we see here is sovereign financing. Now, what is sovereign financing? In simple words, it means that a state or a nation state undertakes the responsibility or dons on the hat of a bank, wherein it lends money and in exchange of certain interest or profits to itself. Now, when we speak about sovereign financing, the two phenomena are this: one is the country which is borrowing, the other one which is lending. Now, the power dynamics between these, I do not have to tell you about it. It is quite akin to the power dynamics between the bank and us when we are the lender and the bank is, we are the borrower and the bank is the lender. So now, with this basic understanding of the two important terms, let us go towards sovereign financing and Chinese debt trap. John Adams famously said, a way to subjugate a country is either through a sword or a debt. And Brahma Chenali, an Indian geostrategist and a think tank, he contends that China has chosen the latter, that is debt. He explains that Chinese debt trap is a situation where a creditor country intentionally lends excessive credit to a smaller debtor country, intending to extract economic or political concessions when the smaller country cannot service the loans. Now, this term was coined in a famous article called China's Debt Trap Diplomacy by Sir Brahma Chenali. Now, he gives the classic example. His exhibit A is Sri Lanka, and by that time, Sri Lanka had already fallen into debt trap, and it had already leased its Hambantota port, the famous exhibit A. Now, there have been mounting concerns about Chinese debt trap, not just in Sri Lanka, but all across the globe. Now, it is said that it frequently uses national assets as collateral, compelling refinancing every couple of years and Hambantota port is just an example of it. Now, moving to the next, Chinese debt traps and the Belt Road Initiative. Now, why does China do it? Now, we need to look at their motives, right? So now, to look at it, I would draw your attention to the two images on screen. I know they wouldn't be clear, but all that you have to look at is the lines on the former one and the red spots on the later one. The first one shows the Belt Road and the maritime project which China has undertaken, and the second is the Chinese loans around the world. Now, you would see that the location of the loans around the world and the Belt Road Initiative coincide. Now, what does this tell us? Is there a motive? Does it show us a motive behind why China is doing so? Yes, it does. Now, moving towards why Sri Lanka. Now, is Sri Lanka just a chance? Is it just a coincidence, or was there larger dynamics behind it? Now, Sri Lanka is an island nation which stands at the crossroads of the world's busiest shipping lanes, and it is world's second busiest oil transit choke points. Not just that, it is the choke point from which China imports 2/3 of its oil and also exports to the West. Now, that is the reason why Sri Lanka. Now, how Sri Lanka is what we are going to see, the story of Sri Lanka. Now, before the Hambantota port, there were 3 major ports, and the 3 major ports, the major one was Colombo port, which still hadn't or still hasn't realized its potential. In 2019, the port handles 7.2 million TUE, and its capacity to 2040 could have gone to 35 million TUE. But that didn't happen so. The country was in an attempt to bring it out of poverty and to develop further. The then government decided to construct a new port, seeking that it would attract traffic, and what would happen is the economy would grow, people would get employed, and generally the health of the country would go. That was the optimistic vision for Sri Lanka. Now, they went from door to door, country to country, asking for financing, right? They came to India, India closed its door. They went to IMF, the International Monetary Fund had a research, a report done, and they came up with a negative impact assessment, and they said no. Then was the dragon waiting behind the doors with the offer, that is the Exim Bank, China's Exim Bank, Export and Import Bank of China, which said that, come on, we are going to finance you, we are going to help you develop the Hambantota port. That happened. Now, what happened after that? In 2008, the construction of the Hambantota port started, along with other minor white elephant projects, as I would like to say. And in 2018, when the port actually opened, the result was dismal. It could not attract the traffic that it had hoped for, and that certainly lead to a lot of downfalls. Every year, the losses which were incurred by this port were more than the profits. And finally, the 99 years concession agreement, whereby for the 99 years, China undertook or took the lease of this Hambantota port, which is one of the strategic area, not just only for Sri Lanka, but for India and overall in the Indian Ocean. Now, what was this prompted by? This was prompted by balance of crisis, wherein the expenditure of the country was becoming more than its income or the finances it was raising. Now, because of this, numerous finances were also tried to obtain from China. However, at a point it said no. Now, with that, that is the story. That is what is happening, has happened right now. That is a strategic location. Now, what is the sovereignty of a nation? It is primarily, when we see, it is the land.
Sorry to interrupt, 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, sir. Now, when we see it primarily, it is the land, and a strategic location of Sri Lanka was undertaken or was taken by China. Now, when we speak about it as a vehicle of neocolonialism, I hope I am able to convince you, at least till here, that there are at least 4 ways, and we are going to build a structure on it. The Chinese loan comprised only of the 10% of the foreign debts in 2017. However, there were certain clauses. Now, this agreement between China and Sri Lanka, as well as the other debt contracts or the loan contracts with all the other nations, are secret. Now, there has been a report or investigation which has come up with the 100 secret agreements which China has with other developing nations, which showcase that provisions such as no Paris Club clause, exemption from debt restructuring efforts, and non-disclosure agreements and preferred creditors are used by China in order to gain this benefits of the loans which are extended. Now, the ambiguity of international law and investment, with regard to lease and no regulatory framework, China has been able to further its geopolitical claims. Like the European gun road diplomacy created new markets and colonies, China uses sovereign financing to bend the will of other nations and create state-perpetrated neocolonialism induced via sovereign financing. Today, China enjoys military presence owing to the lease. It controls the government and the policies and also the economic freedom to govern the port as per its will and use the Belt Road Initiative or further the Belt Road Initiative. Now finally coming to regulating the sovereign financing, yes, there is a law, or rather I would say that yes, there are principles, that is the principles on responsible sovereign borrowings and lendings. However, they fall short. They were developed in 2012, however they are just merely principles in international law and not binding rules or conventions or regulations. There is an organization required besides IMF who can look into sovereign financing, and I propose the World Investment Organization. Now with that, there was also a need that IMF takes a larger role in tackling the delicate issue and governing international sovereign financing to ensure that sovereignty of the nation is intact, and this can be helped by the World Investment Organization. Lastly, I would like to say a nation's development is characterized by increased flow of capital, and this capital is viewed as a ray of light at the end of the underdevelopment's dark tunnel. However, what will be the situation when these rays of light are actually emitting from the greedy mouth of a dragon waiting to devour a nation's sovereignty? The world as a global community, we need to be aware and come up with better regulations and rules so that the concept of development and welfare of the borrowers and lenders can be looked into. Thank you for your patient hearing.